tonight to give a presentation that critiques diversity initiatives used on both college campuses and corporate America. Without further ado, please help me welcome Tim Watts.
Thank you very much. Nice crowd, very good. One of two things obviously is true at Providence College. Either, number one, there is an intense interest in the subject of racism and racial inequality and discrimination and privilege and injustice, or alternately, extra credit still counts for something in the halls of higher education, including here at Providence College. And that's okay. Yay, extra credit. I get it. Doesn't matter if that's why you're here. If you were bribed or cajoled or heavily encouraged by faculty to come and attend, that's okay, because regardless of your motivation, whether it is purely out of interest in the subject matter or whether it is academic in nature, the truth is either way is fine with me because the lights are up. It's a small room. If you get up to leave, I'm going to notice, and I'll probably call you out. So you might want to just hang tight. Get you out of here in about an hour or so, do some Q&A, sell you some books in the back. That's my little subliminal plug for merchandise. And then I'll let you get out of here and see how the basketball game winds up. So, before I get into the meat of my remarks this evening, I want to start off by suggesting that I am fully aware, after 23 years of doing anti-racism work of some form and 17, almost 18 years of being on the road, speaking around the country about this, that this is not the easiest conversation for people to engage. It's not the most comfortable conversation for people to become involved in or with. And so because I realize that, and because I realize there are some difficult aspects of talking about race and identity and privilege and inequality, I want to sort of ease us into the discussion. There's a lot of stuff that'll be harder to deal with. We'll get to that. But I want to sort of ease into it as a way to lay the groundwork for what I hope will be, in spite of how difficult it can sometimes be, nonetheless a productive conversation. I'm going to do that by telling you a story, just at the outset, which really actually doesn't have anything to do with racism. So this is how easy it's going to be. It's not even a story about the topic. But it's a story that, when I'm done telling it to you, I'm hopeful and fairly confident that you're going to understand, and if you don't, I'm going to tell you what the point is, so it's all good. You will understand that even though the story isn't about racism and discrimination and inequality and injustice, that it does, in fact, teach a lesson about those things and what we have to do in the face of them. So here's the story. It's a story that has to do with something that happened to me when I got out of college. When I graduated from Tulane in May of 1990, 23 years ago, I came to the conclusion, for reasons that are still completely unclear to me, that it would be a brilliant idea if I moved into a very large house with 9 other people. I would like now to give you some life advice. Okay? And if you don't learn another thing that I say tonight, that would be a shame, because I have more. But if you don't learn anything else, for the love of God, remember this one. Write this down, tweet this to yourself, put it on your Facebook wall, write it on the back of the person in front of you, get it tattooed on your arm, whatever you need to do. I'm telling you, this is the most important single piece of wisdom I'm going to impart this evening. Never should you come to the conclusion that it is a good idea to move into a very large house with 9 other people. It is not going to be a good idea. It is going to be a horrible idea. It doesn't matter. You can try to make it political by calling it a co-op. I don't care. It's not going to work. It's not going to be a co-op. It's not going to be political. It's just going to be a big, nasty house with 10 people living in it. That's all. But we thought it was going to be great. We were all excited. Why? Because, as you can probably imagine, at the very least, we figured we'd save money, right? Because you got 10 people living together, and you're just out of college, so you're broke. Newsflash, that's what's coming. So write that down too. So you're thinking, well, we got 10 people. We don't even have to like each other, man. We just got to not kill each other. We can save enough money and we get our own place, right? So, man, it was good on that level. It was a good idea. Rent was $525 a month. I don't mean per person, I mean total. I know y'all don't remember 1990 personally, and that makes me sad. But let me assure you that even in 1990, $52.50 per person was good. That was really good. You had all the other utility bills, the cable bill, all of that stuff. It was still less than $100 a month per person. So on that level, you couldn't beat it. It was a great, brilliant idea. But about 6 weeks into this little experiment in communal living, I came to understand why this had been a terrible mistake and why we really should have just been broke and eating ramen every night and not, worried about saving money. Right, this is how I learned it. I came back from work one evening. I was working downtown, living uptown, got off the streetcar, walked the 4.5 to 5 blocks into the neighborhood, walked up the steps, the house where we were living, opened the door. I was met by this incredible smell, and I mean it in a good way, which, when you live with 9 other people, you can't often say. You're often met by smells that are usually not good. This one, on the other hand, was great. It was the smell of dinner being prepared by one of the roommates, because we didn't just split the bills, we also split the cooking responsibilities. We took turns, right? And it was this one guy's night, and he was making a big pot of gumbo on the left front burner of the stove. This is New Orleans, and that's what you do, right? And man, it looked good, and it smelled good. And it even had shrimp in there. Not many, like I said, we were broke, but there were 3. 3 of those really little bitty-ass shrimp, those teeny, tiny little shrimp that are so small, they make popcorn shrimp look like jumbo shrimp. They make jumbo shrimp look like lobster. Some of y'all know, because that's like the kind of shrimp students can typically do. Well, so there was like 3 of them, and we thought, oh, that's great, we're having seafood gumbo. Well, whatever, you got to tell yourself, right? And so it looked great, it smelled great, but when my roommate asked me if I wanted any, I actually told him no, because as it turned out, I had already eaten. I didn't know he was making gumbo. If I'd known, I might have waited, but I didn't know, so I didn't wait. I'd already had dinner downtown before getting on the streetcar. So I told him when he asked me, hey man, do me a favor, just take it, put it in the container, put it in the fridge, I'll take it to work tomorrow. It looks great. He said, cool, I'll do that. I said, fine. I went upstairs, hung out with the roommates, did whatever we did for fun in 1990, which wasn't much. It was like the Stone Ages of fun, The social networking was like you just walk down the hall to your roommate's room and you're like, hey, what you doing? And they were like, nothing, it's 1590. I forgot. Okay, we'll just go to bed then. So I went to bed sort of early. Wasn't that bad, but it was close, okay? Went to bed and woke up the next morning, came downstairs to get some coffee to get ready for work, and I noticed that right there on the left front burner of that stove, right where it had been 12 hours earlier, it was the same pot of gumbo. Now, it did not look as good as it had. And it definitely did not smell as good as it had the night before, right? It was getting all crusty and disgusting on the sides of the pot. And I wasn't real happy with my roommate, but as it turned out, he was still asleep. And even though part of me wanted to wake him up and get mad at him for this and yell at him and get him to clean it, I thought, no, I'm going to be nice. I'm going to go to work. I'm going to clean it first, even though it's not really my fault. I'm going to clean it, and then I'll take it up with him when I get back. So I took the pot of gumbo and walked it over to the sink, and I got the scrub brush, and I got the soap, some gloves, because it was really nasty. I didn't really want to touch it, right? I started to run the water, so I was going to just go ahead and clean it. And right as the water goes into the pot and I started to clean this nasty mess, I stopped myself, right? And I said, wait a minute. I don't have to clean this. Now I felt really self-righteous and really smart, too, because I was talking myself out of doing the hard work, which is a skill I learned in college, right? So stay tuned. You'll learn this, too, if you haven't already, right? I was so excited. By God, I wasn't going to clean it. So I took the pot of gumbo and I put it right back where I found it, right? Marched off to work, leaving it on the left front burner of the stove, assuming that at some point he would wake up and clean the mess that he'd made. I come back that evening at about 6:30 and I walked into the house. I noticed that one of my other roommates was making dinner for the evening on the right front burner of the stove. But over on the left front burner, right where it has been now for 24 hours, is the same pot of gumbo. Now it's even worse, right? Now it's even more disgusting. I looked at my roommate in dismay and I said to him, man, how in the world can you make dinner for us on the right front burner of that stove when I'm pretty confident you can smell last night's dinner because it's right there? Why don't you clean that? He said, hey man, I didn't make it. I wasn't even here for dinner last night. Did you have any of the gumbo? He said to me, I said, hey man, don't look at me. He said, well, neither did I. Now we both knew what that meant. Neither one of us were cleaning that mess, and we felt incredibly intelligent for having talked ourselves out of the work. He looked at me and said, would you like some lentils and rice? I said, yes, son. And I ate my dinner, and I put the plate in the dish rack after I cleaned it off so it would dry. I went upstairs, listened to music, watched TV, whatever we did again for fun in 1990, and ultimately fell asleep sort of early. 7 a.m. came, and I had forgotten to set an alarm. But now here's a tip, and I probably don't have to tell you this, but I will just in case. If you are living in a house where a pot of gumbo has been sitting on the left front burner of your stove for what is now 36 and a half hours, trust me when I tell you that you are not going to need an alarm clock to wake you up. Because the smell is going to crawl out of the pot of gumbo on the legs that it grew overnight. And no, English majors, I am not speaking in metaphor. I mean that literally, as in the stench is going to grow legs and feet, crawl up out the pot, across the kitchen, across the living room floor, go up the back stairs, down the back hall, under your door frame, and find with the precision of a laser that thing on the front of your face that you call a nose, and you will be awake. And now I was, and I was not happy because I knew what was waiting for me on the left front burner of that stove, having not been cleaned by anybody, least of all the guy that made the mess, right? So I'm upset. I throw my door open. I start stomping down the hall, trying to wake up any of my roommates, trying to let everybody know how displeased I am, making sure that they can't miss my anger. I live with 9 other people, can't find one. And the guy that made the gumbo is like, where's Waldo? Nobody knows where in the hell he was. It's like he made the gumbo as a practical joke and then skipped town to see how long it would take for someone else to clean it up. I got down to the bottom of the stairs, looked across the living room into the kitchen. I saw the gumbo, and I'm confident that the gumbo saw me. And it was in that moment, not one moment earlier, but definitely not even a moment later, that I came to understand the most important lesson I'd ever learned. And not just about household cleanliness, but about any subject in or out of a classroom prior to that time or even since. And what was that lesson? The lesson was, it didn't really matter anymore, did it, whether I made the mess. It didn't really matter anymore whether I was, as the old saying goes, the author of all this unpleasantness. The only thing that mattered was I was tired of living in that funk, right? I was tired of living with the residue of what someone else had done without my involvement, without my participation, but nonetheless, actions that were now having consequences for me and the environment that I shared with those other people. And the same is true with human society. When we get tired of living in the funk, metaphorically speaking, when we get tired of living with the residue of what other folks did in generations past, we will clean up the mess, not because we're to blame for it. We didn't create it, but we've inherited its legacy, and we have to be accountable to and responsible for taking the world as we find it and trying to shape it into something else that it can be, more than what it is when we find it. You see, we're not to blame, but we are responsible. There's a difference between guilt and responsibility. Guilt is what you feel for the stuff you've actually done. Responsibility is something to take because of the kind of person that you are. And so in that moment, I realized, even though I wasn't to blame for the problem, if I didn't clean it, it wasn't going to get cleaned, quite possibly. And the same is true with our country and the legacy of racial inequality and economic inequality and sexual and gendered inequality. Right? We have a long tradition and history of formal white supremacy, formal patriarchal oppression of women, formal class oppression of working class and lower income folks, formal oppression of LGBT brothers and sisters of ours. And unless we are prepared to address the history that has brought us to this point, right, then we are in effect perpetuating the injustice. Even though we did not create it, we become complicit in it when we find it in front of us and do nothing in response to it. Because inertia, right, which is this thing we learned about in what, like 2nd or 3rd grade science maybe, right? This idea that an object in motion tends to stay in motion until it's stopped by the weight of a force of some greater or equal value that is able to stop its trajectory. Well, that's not just true for the physical universe. That's true for the economic universe and the political universe and the social universe. That which happens in one generation affects the next and the next and the next, right on down the line until someone else says stop. And so we have to be accountable to the past because it affects the present and can, if we're not careful, over-determine the future. But we also have to understand the past, whether it's in our own home and our own family lives, which if you think about that, many of us who come from pretty jacked up, dysfunctional families, and I know that's probably every one of us if we're really being honest, most of us do, right? If we want to actually get healthy and be stronger adults and better parents ourselves and better friends to other folks, we got to deal with our damage. We have to deal with our history. Well, the country has to do the same, not only so that we can fix those problems, but so that we can have an adequate conversation about them in the first place. Because the problem is when we don't have that conversation, when we don't understand how we got to this place, and we don't understand how communities came to look the way they do, or the way they don't. Who lives in this community as opposed to who doesn't? Who goes to this school as opposed to who doesn't? Who has this kind of job by and large as opposed to who doesn't? See, if you don't ask how those things came about, if you don't understand the predicates to the current social phenomena that you observe, it's very easy to then assume That it must have just been a coincidence that certain communities are overwhelmingly white and other communities are overwhelmingly black and brown, and that 50% of all indigenous Native North Americans live on reservations because they just like Oklahoma and they just like Pine Ridge, South Dakota. And they just wanted to go to the places where the government and private companies strip mine uranium, causing them to have healthcare cancer effects that are 17 times the national average, as if somehow that's a coincidence that black and brown folk are concentrated in urban areas, that Latino folk are concentrated in the American Southwest and in certain urban areas, and that white folks just so happen to disproportionately populate the suburbs, as if there was no predicate to that. As if the history of Providence College, the fact that it's historically been such an overwhelmingly white space, is just like the result of sunspots. You know, we don't know how that happened. I'm sure it was just totally a coincidence, right? But the people at Providence College in charge of this place know it wasn't a coincidence. That's why they want diversity initiatives. That's why they press to do something different and to move the school in a different direction. But see, if we're not having an honest conversation about how PC became PC, and about the history of unequal access and opportunity, not only here, but at every college and university just about in the whole country, then it becomes really easy for us to hear about things like diversity initiatives and say, why do we need to do that? Or, we shouldn't need to do that. Or, what's the point in doing that? That seems unfair. That seems discriminatory, because we're not looking at the predicate. So I get it. Like, I understand if you haven't had the conversation, and honestly, who among us did before we got to college? Very few. Very few of us in high school or middle school were having conversations about the history of systemic inequality or systemic discrimination, institutional oppression. Like you'd have to have a really great high school teacher to even raise that stuff. Most of the time we don't hear that. So we come to an institution, whether it's a college, a university, law school, med school, grad school, or even out there in the world of work, we go to a job, and if we're not thinking about why certain jobs are male-dominated, and why certain jobs are white-dominated, and why certain jobs are dominated by upper middle class and affluent people, then we act as if somehow, A, it's just a coincidence, B, there's nothing we can do about it, C, there's nothing we should do about it. So I understand why we're in that spot, but I think we have to move beyond that. When we haven't had the conversation, it's very easy to miss the importance of being color conscious, gender and sex conscious, class conscious in the way that we develop our policies. You know, I'm fully aware of the recent controversy here, and I understand that sometimes things get said by folks and other folks feel that those things are insensitive and naive and ill-informed, and then other people think that the people who think those things are naive and ill-informed are overreacting, and see, we're still talking past each other, right? So I think what we need to do is step back for just a second and think very clearly about what this current moment here at the college, because of the article that was in the paper and the reaction to that article, what opportunity that's given us here at this institution, for which we probably in the long run should be grateful, as painful as the conversation can be. It gives us an opportunity to engage around this very issue, which is exactly the kind of thing you ought to be struggling with as a college student, which is exactly the kind of thing that we need to be struggling with as Americans at this particular moment, as the country in the next 25 to 30 years, as we know from demographers, is headed toward a place that's going to be about 50% white folks and 50% people of color. So we got to have these conversations about access and equity and who's represented and who's not, right? Because if we're going to have a functional society for everyone, not just for folks of color, but for white folks too, not just for women, but for men too, not just for lower income folks, but for affluent folks too, not just for LGBT folks, but for straight folks too, we're going to have to talk about how we are going to make our country's increasing cultural diversity and increasing representation work at an institutional level. And I think the problem is that too oftentimes, having not had that conversation, it's very easy for some to believe that if we just stop thinking about color, if we just stop targeting opportunities to people of color, as with the diversity initiative so-called, everything would work out okay. That talking about race, talking about racism, trying to actually do something to ensure that people of color really have true equal opportunity, that's what causes racism. And if we would just not talk about it and not think about it and be colorblind and color mute and not engage these topics, and everything would be fine. But the more we talk about racism, that's what folks will say. You keep talking about it, that's what keeps it alive, right? There isn't another social problem on the face of the earth about which you would say that, right? That the answer to the problem is silence, right? Like, try that out with some other problems, like world hunger. right? Oh my God, there are billions of children all around the globe who are starving to death. Shh! Talk about that, fool. Talk about that, children will in fact starve. If you would just be quiet about that, food would miraculously appear in the legs of those children. My God, what an easy solution. Why didn't we think of that? Well, because it's stupid as hell, that's why. Or crime. Are you worried about crime? Oh, I'm worried about crime. I've been held up at gunpoint, had my car broken into once, had my apartment broken into. Shh! Talk about crime. If you talk about crime, someone is apt to get carjacked tonight. You just wouldn't talk about crime, crime would stop. We could close all the prisons, we could let everyone out of jail, we could let the cops all go get a different job. My God, what an amazing solution. No, it's ridiculous. No other problem would we counsel silence. Except this one. It's like blaming your speedometer for the speeding ticket you got. Right? It makes no sense. The speedometer didn't cause you to go 100 to 65. It just told you what you did. That's what the conversation does. It tells us who we are and where we are as a people and as a society. And I'm afraid that too often critics of deliberate diversity efforts, and this isn't just at a college, this is true in corporate America as well, that critics of diversity efforts, or sometimes they are called affirmative action efforts, seem to be of the opinion, naive as I think it is, they seem to believe that our choices are either that we think about and target opportunity to people who have been historically marginalized, like people of color or women of all colors or working class people of all races or whatever. Or the alternative to that is that we have a nice objective selection process where we just hire and admit people based on merit. That it's one of those two things. Either it's pure merit selection, right, or it's some rigged diversity scheme. But those aren't actually the options. Because in the absence of deliberate efforts to include people of color in our institutions, whether that's a college or a workplace, in the absence of deliberate efforts to include women in male-dominated professions from which they have historically been often excluded or marginalized, in the absence of deliberate efforts to extend opportunity to working-class people on the basis of economics, regardless of race, those individuals, people of color, women of all colors, and working-class and lower-income folks of all races, will not, in fact, have equal opportunity. They will not be in those institutions in large numbers. They will continue to be overlooked for a couple of reasons. One is ongoing bias, which although we might want to wish it away and act like it's not there, all the evidence says still is a problem. And also, in addition to overt bias, systematic inequalities built into our society, which are not the fault of people of color, not the fault of those women, not the fault of lower-income folks, but which limit their access anyway. What do I mean by that? Well, for instance, what we know is, in the job market, right now, African-American folks with college degrees did everything right, went to college, stayed in college, graduated, got their degree. Black folks with a degree almost twice as likely as whites with a degree to be out of work. Latinos with a degree about 50 to 60% more likely than whites with a degree to be out of work. Asian Americans with a degree about a third more likely than whites with a degree to be out of work. So in other words, even when peoples of color have the same credentials, the same qualifications, they have the same educational background, they are still in far worse shape economically, not because they aren't qualified, not because they lack merit, but because either there is overt bias happening when they're applying for jobs, so even though they have credentials, those credentials are not given the same credit, right? Or, maybe even more likely, too oftentimes jobs aren't filled because of merit anyway. They're filled based on networks, filled based on who you know, not what you know. 80 to 90%, depending on which year's data you look at, but at least 80% of all jobs in this country are never truly openly advertised. They're filled through networking. And who are the people that are disproportionately likely to be left out of the best networks for jobs? They're going to be lower income folks of all colors, working class people, right? It's going to be women, right, who are locked out of a lot of male-dominated networks, and it's going to be people of color who don't have the same access to those good networks that a disproportionate number of white folks have, right, because of residential segregation, the history of it, and the fact that we still tend to live among people that are a lot like ourselves. 85% of all whites in this country live in neighborhoods where there are almost no people of color around. So even if those white folks aren't bigoted at all, right, even if there isn't any overt racism or intentional prejudice, deliberate biases in those white folks, if the only people they really know and hang out with if the people they recreate with, if the people they see at work, if the people that they go to church or whatever with, right, happen to all be white, even if they're not deliberately biased, that means the networks that they create are going to be white, and people of color will be excluded from opportunities, even if they're the most qualified person for something. So if employers don't make deliberate diversity efforts, if they don't deliberately go and try to find those qualified peoples of color who maybe aren't in the network, they're not going to find them. Not because they aren't there, but because they just simply don't know about them. Same thing with women, same thing with working class folks. A woman of whatever color, a working class person of whatever color, a person of color of whatever class, might be the most qualified person for job X, Y, or Z. But if they don't even know job X, Y, or Z exists, then they can't apply for it, can they? And if they can't apply for it, they can't even be rejected for it. They don't even have an access. They're scratched at the beginning of the race, so to speak. So companies can't just sit back and say, oh, we'll hire the most qualified person and call that fairness. We'll just wait for them to walk through the door and apply for the job. Some folks don't know the door is there. Some folks don't know the job is there. Some folks don't feel entitled to just walk through that door because they haven't been in that space, so they're not even sure if they're going to be welcome. Thinking about white students in historically white colleges versus black and brown students in historically white colleges. By the way, I know we don't call them HWCUs, which is telling, I think, because we do call historically black colleges by that name. We call them HBCUs. Historically white colleges, we just call them colleges. Which tells you a lot about the centrality of whiteness and the privileging of the white norm. That we don't have to actually name our stuff. We just get to call it college, you see. But for people of color coming to a mostly white space, a historically white space, there's a real concern, and it's not unreasonable, that they may or may not be truly welcome in that spot, because they're certainly going to be under a spotlight, they're certainly going to stand out, and it's no different than for those of us who are white. Like, I can ask all the white folks in this room, why didn't you go to a HBCU? There are a lot of good ones. You could have. See, they're laughing about it. They know that's a crazy-ass question, right? They know. And it is sort of. But why didn't we? Why didn't those of us who are white, why didn't we go to an HBCU? There are an awful lot of good HBCUs you could have gone to that are academically every bit as solid as this institution, every bit as solid as any of the elite institutions in our country. But for the most part, we don't go to them. And it's not because necessarily we're overtly racist or we don't want to be around black people or whatever else. I mean, I'm sure that's it for some people, but right? But that's not even it. Mostly, you know what it is? It's because we would feel really strange being that outnumbered, being that out of place. We might even wonder, gee, I wonder if I'll be welcome there. I wonder if I'll have a good reception there. Or I wonder if I won't be wanted in that space, right? That is the kind of thing that we do feel when we find ourselves in a very rare occasion in a mostly person of color space. But that's the point. We almost never find ourselves in those spaces. Right? How often do those of us who are white actually find ourselves in a mostly black or brown school, in a mostly black or brown neighborhood? Very rarely. People of color, on the other hand, have to deal with white folks. Often we are like that kid in The Sixth Sense. People of color are like that kid in The Sixth Sense who sees dead people. They see white people because we are everywhere. It is hard to work around us. So people of color have to deal with us in institutional space, and they have to ask themselves those questions about whether they're going to be accepted. That's real, you see. And so unless jobs, unless schools go out of their way to make an effort to invite and to target and to make sure that folks have access, they may not have access. A study from just a few years ago found, for instance, that job applicants with white-sounding names, 50% more likely to get called back for an interview than applicants with quote-unquote black-sounding names, even when all the qualifications are the same experience, same level of education. Just having a white name, whatever that means, right? And you can determine for yourself if you got one and how this would work out for you. But just having a white name gives you a leg up in the job market. So if that's true, employers have to make real deliberate efforts to overcome some of that embedded bias. Same thing is true with schools, since we're talking about diversity efforts at a college here in D.C. We know right now, for instance, that students of color, particularly black and Latino students in this country, are about 12 times more likely than their white counterparts to attend a school that is a place of concentrated poverty with a disproportionate number of poor students, which tends to mean that resources are spread far more thinly, right? That the infrastructure of the school is not nearly as advanced, that the opportunities, the course offerings are not nearly as good. In fact, what's interesting is even African American students from middle and upper middle class families with more than $60,000 or even $70,000 a year in annual income, those black students who are not poor are more likely to attend a mostly poor school than white folks who are poor. right? Because white folks who are poor usually don't live in concentrated poverty areas, so even if we are poor, we tend to be in a school that's mostly not, and that gives us a certain leg up in terms of the resources available, in terms of the quality of the instruction, in terms of the course offerings, AP classes, honors classes. On average, schools that serve black students and Latino students have 1/3 as many of those classes being offered, right? And black and Latino students are twice as likely as white students to have the least experienced teachers, only 1 or 2 years of teaching experience. White students twice as likely to have the most experienced teachers. So at every level, from kindergarten through 12th grade, 13 years of education, we have systematized affirmative action for white people. Systematic, institutionalized advantages for 13 years, and then all of a sudden, white folks, we lose our mind when a college says they'd like to actually maybe try to blunt some of that. Like, oh my God, you're going to do something special for those people, for those, what's the phrase, perceived minorities? Yes, I think that was it. We're going to target opportunity to them. We're going to do something special for them. That's not fair. You never did anything special for me, except everything for the last 13 years. Every single thing. K through 12 preferences, making it necessary. And if we don't do something once we get to college, then that's like having an 8-lap relay race, right? And you've got one team that's running that has a 5-lap head start in the 8-lap race. It would be like saying, even though that 5-lap head start didn't come about because of more effort, it came about because of systematic unequal opportunity. But it would be like saying, oh well, rather than try to put everybody else at the same spot and actually see who can run faster, which would make the most sense, it would be like saying, oh well, I guess they're going to cross the finish line first and get into this college or win this race. Well, of course, if you have a 5-lap head start, you're supposed to cross the finish line first. That's how that works, right? And in fact, if you have a 5-lap head start and you don't cross the finish line first, there is something wrong with you. In fact, even if the other people catch up and make it only a 4-lap race or a 3-lap race, technically you still won, but now who's faster? See, that's the kind of conversation colleges are in effect having. What they are saying at their best is that they realize that there's a history of unequal access, so you can't just take some standards of so-called qualifications, standards of merit, and just look at them in the abstract. You can't just abstract them from the real-world experiences of students. And so if certain students have had a head start, their test score is supposed to look better, their grades are supposed to be better, their file is supposed to be better, their letters of reference and recommendation will probably be more impressive, but that doesn't tell you whether they're actually going to be better as students, whether they're going to be more capable, whether they're going to actually work harder and put in more effort. You can't tell that. And in fact, what you might actually believe, if you think about it for just a few minutes, is that the person who starts out with less advantages, whether it's a person of color dealing with racism, whether it's a woman trying to go into a male-dominated field dealing with sexism, right? Whether it's a working-class person dealing with an economic class structure that's so unequal, what you might say to yourself is, for them to have come this far, they might actually be the most qualified person for this job, or the most qualified person for this college slot, because in order for them to get to that place, they had to overcome more, they had to persevere against more. That's got to be part of our consideration. That's what diversity efforts, that's what affirmative action efforts are predicated on. It's not about giving goodies to people just because they have skin that is darker. It is about, quote-unquote, giving goodies, if we want to be that cynical, but I would suggest simply giving opportunity to people based on a recognition that that color matters, that it means something, that it tells us something about the wealth and the breadth of experiences that we're likely to have. Does that mean that every black student, every Latino student, every Asian student, or for that matter, every white student has had the very same life? Of course not. There's a wide range of opportunities. Some of us have had more than others, even within those racial categories. But to deny the historic and contemporary reality of racial inequality in the name of colorblindness is to, as Julian Bond says, to be blind to the consequences of color. And if you're blind to the consequences of color, you can't very well remedy them. So we have to be thinking about that, whether it's in the job market or in the schools. And this is something, very importantly, that I want to point out to you, in case you don't know, that folks in the civil rights struggle understood. I know that part of the essay that touched off so much controversy here made the claim, I think it was well-intended, I suppose, but it made the claim that, this sort of not thinking about race or being colorblind, etc., was sort of what the civil rights movement was all about. This is something that one could only truly believe if one had never studied the civil rights movement. And certainly one could not have read the words of Dr. King and actually believe that the goal of the movement was colorblindness, that the goal of the movement was not to think about or target opportunity on the basis of race, if all we have done in this country is heard one line from one of Dr. King's speeches, and that's all we've heard, because it's the only line they ever play, because it's this nice, abstract, somewhat philosophically neutered line, right, from the I Have a Dream speech about treating people on the basis of the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Oh my goodness, that of course means that Dr. King would have opposed these things like affirmative action and so-called racial preferences and diversity efforts, except that that's totally wrong. And here's how we know that that's totally wrong, because see, Dr. King didn't just give that one speech. He actually spoke every Sunday somewhere. He was a preacher, right? And he actually wrote books. But strangely enough, we don't actually require anyone to read those books. And if we don't actually read them, if we're not asked to read them and expected to interpret what they mean and learn what they mean, it becomes very easy to have this view of the civil rights struggle as being just about being colorblind. But what did Dr. King actually say about this? He addressed this in a book that was published the very same year as the I Have a Dream speech. A book called Why We Can't Wait. And what he said was this: whenever this issue of compensatory or preferential treatment is raised, some of our friends recoil in horror. The Negro should be granted equality, they insist, but nothing more. At first this may seem reasonable, but in fact it's unrealistic, for it's obvious that if you take one man and put him at the starting line of a race 350 years after another man, right, that you can't call that fairness. In other words, it isn't fair, it isn't adequate to call this a fair race when we have hundreds of years of inequality. Even Ronald Reagan got this. This is deep. By the time he was president, he'd forgotten it. Okay? But when he was governor of the state of California, he actually understood this too. And in 1974, in the first couple of months of that year, right before he left office, right, he left office that year, but in one of those last acts as governor of California, he actually signed into law, the affirmative action programs in that state, which were abolished in 1996 by state referendum, so they're not there now. But they were from 1974 to 96, and Ronald Reagan was in part responsible. Here's what Reagan said. Reagan said, "Time and experience have shown that laws and edicts of non-discrimination are not enough. Justice demands that each and every citizen consciously adopt and accentuate a real and personal commitment to affirmative action so as to make equal opportunity a reality." In other words, even he understood that you couldn't just say, now go out there and run the race, opportunity is equal, that in fact things were still very much tilted in favor of the dominant group and against everyone else, and that even people who were highly qualified were going to continue to be excluded. And I think, if we're honest, we sort of know this. Even the article in question here in the student paper, it was very interesting, right, that the author made a very interesting point. She said that we shouldn't have to really try for diversity because in a perfect world it would happen naturally. Yes. And unicorns are nice. Which is to say that we have to deal with the very imperfect society in which we live. It may be true that in a perfect society we wouldn't have to do these things. Of course, that's accurate. And it would be very nice were we in that spot. But I think even the fact that she wrote it the way she did, she said, in a perfect world, this wouldn't be necessary. Even she knows at some level, right? She has to know that we're not in that world, and just acting like we are, pretending that we've arrived at that day won't make it true. It's not like Kevin Costner in that film about baseball, where he just like, build it and they will come. If I dream about a baseball stadium and a cornfield, a bunch of old white dudes come back and play ball. But that's not how it works. You have to do the work. You have to put in the effort and put in the time, you see. So rather than engage in false hope that's going to bring about magically some institutional transformation, we have to do the hard work, and the hard work means deliberately seeking out those folks who otherwise would be overlooked and ensuring that they are in the spot. And we cannot get bogged down with absurdities. One of the things that always gets said, in these kind of discussions, people will say, well now, if a company was saying that they were trying to increase the numbers of white people, we call that racist. If a college were trying to say we need to make sure we have X number of white people, that would be racist. As if somehow that is an equivalent to what a diversity effort for peoples of color at a college is somehow that's equal to that. Of course, it's absurd because no white institutions have ever had to try and ensure white representation. That's the point, right? Sort of like asking, well, why are there no hospitals for healthy people? My God, that's not fair. Why are there no special parking spaces for the able-bodied at the mall? They have all these disabled spots. Preferential treatment. I'm able-bodied. I want a spot. It's like saying, why aren't there soup kitchens for the wealthy? I mean, that's not fair. There should be soup kitchens for us, those of us who have money. Why aren't there heterosexual pride parades? For God's sake, we want to march. That whole rhetoric, well, what about us? What about us? What about us? Ignores power, ignores social reality, ignores social context and history. It ignores what it means to be a member of a marginalized group. And too oftentimes, those who critique these efforts write as if history never happened, or as if it did happen, but we shouldn't spend much time worrying about it because it doesn't have any impact on the present, none of which is true. And so not only at this institution, but at any other institution, trying to prepare students for the real world, not some abstract world, but for the real world. And I looked on y'all's website, I read the mission statement. It's lovely. Lovely. There's this one part in particular, very bottom of the mission statement. Providence College prepares its students to be responsible and productive citizens to serve in their own society and the greater world. Fantastic. But here's the thing. If Providence College is going to be able to actually do that, to actually prepare you to be a productive citizen serving the society and the greater world community, you have to be familiar with what that community looks like, and you've got to be used to operating in environments that reflect that community, because if you're in an institution that continues to remain overwhelmingly monocultural, right, or less diverse than it could be, overwhelmingly, I should also point out, affluent. That's another problem that colleges really need to address, because not enough working class folks, including working class white folks, have true, full, equal access to colleges because of expense and because of cutbacks in financial aid and because of, loan burdens that are just out of control for just about every one of us when we get out of college. So schools have got to do a better job there too, because most of the world doesn't look like this. Right? I'm not trying to be critical, I'm just being descriptive and observational, right? Most of the world are people of color, they're poor, they're women, they don't speak English, and they're not Christian. That's just the truth. Which is to say that the vast majority of people in that greater world community that this school wants to prepare you for don't look like the dominant groups in our own country, let alone in this school. So are you really going to be prepared for that world unless institutions like this take very deliberate, conscious measures to ensure that these spaces you occupy, whether it's a residence hall setting, or whether it's a classroom setting, are in fact truly representative? What kind of service will they be doing to any of you if they don't take that responsibility seriously? How prepared will you really be when you get out there to do any job in an increasingly diverse United States and a world that was already mostly non-white? Right? If you haven't had that experience, it certainly isn't enough to just say, as some have, well, yes, it'd be nice, but problems have to be solved in kindergarten through 12th grade. It's not for Providence College to sort of pick up the problems of the larger society. Yes, we need to have more equity, but Providence College can't afford to lower the standards for children who just haven't had the same access and opportunity. And that's the implication that some would have us believe. But of course, there are two problems with that argument. One is that Providence College is not talking about lowering standards at all, nor is any institution that does diversity or affirmative action work. In fact, every one of these schools, like yours, that has become more diverse over the last 30 years is now more selective than it was 30 years ago. Every one of those Ivy League schools that have stepped up their commitments, right, to diversity, both on a racial and, I should point out, economic level, right? Schools like Yale, Harvard, and Princeton now, like if your family makes less than $100,000, basically it's free, right? So that's a big commitment to economic diversity. Harvard's a hell of a lot better school now than it was 100 years ago, when only rich white men from the East Coast could get in, right? All those schools that were set up for the children of elites, for the children of the children of the children of elites that didn't care how good you were in school, like certain former presidents that shall remain nameless, but got a C all the way through Yale and bragged about it, right? Because you could get a gentleman's C in the 1960s in college. That was okay if you were white. Now, if you were a person of color capable of getting an A, you weren't going to be seen very often in those halls of higher learning. But it didn't matter, right? These schools are better today and more diverse, which is to say there's no contradiction between greater representation of peoples of color and working class folks of all colors, and women in particular, professions and disciplines in particular where they've been excluded. There's no contradiction between that and merit. It's just about understanding that merit has to mean more than test scores and grades and how many AP classes you have. If we have unequal access to those kinds of things, of course there's going to be disparity. The question is whether or not the students are actually less qualified, and the evidence there tells us that in fact they are not. that they are not. That students of color are fully capable. In fact, students of color at the more selected colleges tend to do better than students of color at the less selected colleges, even when they have the same grades or the same test scores. So if you really want to talk about folks of color, where they do and don't belong, the evidence says that they absolutely belong in those institutions that are highly selective and even elite. And they have every right to be able to be there on equal terms with anyone else. But this is something that we just aren't, I guess, prepared as a society to deal with yet. But if we don't deal with it, if we don't have the debate and the discussion, and I'm glad, in a way, that this has become an issue here, because it's an argument that good people can have disagreements about on both sides of the issue, but unless we're dealing with what's real, unless we're looking at the full picture, right, then the debate that this institution is engaged in around diversity is going to go off the rails. Everyone needs to be part of that conversation. Everyone needs to understand the stake that you all have in reducing those disparities and being honest about the fact that when we write articles that are critical of someone else's social reality, which I think was the feeling that a lot of folks had, right? You had students of color who felt like this article, not intentionally necessarily, and I actually read the piece and I didn't think it was intentionally seeking to be hurtful at all. I just thought it came from a place of not knowing, and that's okay. That's what college is for. You go to college to learn things, and we all learn things, and we all learn things after college. So it's perfectly okay to just not know some stuff, right? But the effect of certain words that we say and certain ways that we say them can be really hurtful to people. And it's not a surprise that we don't know it, but the fact that we don't know it is part of our problem, and that's what we need to address, because we all come into this space with our own lens, right? Everybody comes to school with their own lens, and your lens is crafted in the fires of your experience. And your experience is oftentimes determined by your various identities as a person who's white or a person of color, based on your economic status, your sexual and gender status, your sexual identity. All of those things are going to affect how you experience the world, and therefore it's going to affect how you view the world. That just makes sense. Nobody's lens is perfect. All of our lenses are a bit distorted by our experiences, but we need to own that and understand that, and realize that too oftentimes we speak as if there is an objective reality that everyone knows and that it's true for everyone. So that Providence College is Providence College and it's just one big happy family. And how can anyone say that they don't feel welcomed here? How can anyone say that they don't feel as if they're accepted here? Because if that's not our reality, then we assume it can't be anyone else's. But study after study after study for years has found that one of the primary reasons that people of color in mostly white schools don't graduate, if they don't graduate, or don't stick around for the full 4 years if they don't stick around for the full 4 years, it isn't because they can't cut it academically, it's not because they aren't good students, it's because of those feelings of isolation, of those feelings of inadequacy in the eyes of others, not their own eyes, right? But the assumption that perhaps they don't belong. It's being asked by campus security and folks in the library for ID when white folks are not, and I know that's happened here. I know that's been an issue with this institution. That is the kind of thing, experts call that a microaggression, right? It's being treated as if you don't actually belong, right? And I've heard this story hundreds of times in the last 20 years. Several years ago, I was at Oregon State, and there was a young man there who was on the football team. He was a star running back. He was actually a preseason Heisman contender. He didn't end up having a really good senior year, so he wasn't in the running for it at the end. But great, amazing athlete. And very well known on the campus. He'd been on the cover of Sports Illustrated. Everybody knew who this guy was, except apparently the police. Because over the course of Easter break, he was from LA originally, going to school in Corvallis, Oregon, very rural area, mostly white. He didn't have the money to go home to visit his family, right? So he talked about during the 7 or 8 days that they were on break, he got stopped by cops like 6 times. A couple times by the same cop. Each time they asked for ID, acted like they'd never seen him before. Even though he was a star running back, even though he'd been on the cover of Sports Illustrated, they acted like he didn't belong in Corvallis. He finally sold his car, decided to walk everywhere because it just wasn't worth it. This was a guy who was a hero on that campus. This is someone everyone looked up to and respected, yet he was constantly feeling as if he didn't really belong and wasn't really accepted. That's the kind of stuff that those of us in the dominant group, we don't deal with that. We don't have to worry about wondering whether people are going to think we got in here on some kind of special preference, even though, according to a study by the Century Foundation, for every one person of color who received any consideration from affirmative action on a college campus, for every one of those, there's 2 white folks who only got in because they were better connected. Somebody in their family had gone to the college, or knew somebody who had gone to the college, or made a donation to the college. Twice as many white folks getting in under preferential treatment of that kind as there are people of color getting any consideration from affirmative action. But if you're one of those people, nobody will know it unless you tell them. Right? That's the beauty of it. University of Michigan several years ago got in trouble for their affirmative action plan. Everybody lost their mind. Oh, they're giving extra points on a 150-point scale to black kids and Latino kids and indigenous Native North American kids, and that's unfair, giving them 20 extra points on a 150-point scale. That's unfair to white folks. What they didn't mention in their anger and in their opposition was that the very same point system gave you 16 points if you were from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Ever been there? Right? The snow is not the only thing white in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So if you give 16 points to people just because they're from that part of the state, that's a white rural preference. You got 4 points if your parent or grandparent had gone to the University of Michigan. That was almost only white folks who were going to be able to avail themselves of that. You got to 12 points for having taken AP and honors courses. When you added all the points together, there was something like 60 points that pretty much only white folks were going to be able to get because of systematic institutional inequality, and nobody seemed to mind that. It was just the 20 points for people of color that were supposedly the injustice. You see, this too is what I'm talking about. Those folks who got into the University of Michigan because their daddy went there, or got in because they had a really good letter of reference, or they had all these AP classes which they only had because they happened to be in the right zip code to go to the right school which offered those classes. They didn't think of themselves as having received unfair preferential treatment. They just thought of themselves as having merit. Right? Nobody would ever say, oh, are you from the Upper Peninsula? Wow. Well, we know they bent the rules to let you in here, right? But people of color in this room, even those that had higher test scores than we as white folks did, better grades than we did more extracurriculars than we did, even the ones with the best SATs, ACTs, and grades know that there is a real possibility that they're constantly going to be seen as not really belonging, as if somehow some special dispensation had to be made for them. That is the lens that people of color bring because they know that that kind of belief can be there. And those of us who are white, we have the luxury of being oblivious to it. And all I want us to do is stop being oblivious. The only privilege I'm asking people to give up tonight is just one. It's the privilege of being oblivious to the lived experiences of other people. Right? It's the privilege of not knowing. And see, that's a dangerous privilege because when you don't know the way the world works for other people, right, it can cause all kinds of unnecessary conflict. And it's been a long-standing problem for us. Those of us who are white, it's not just now that we don't see it. We've never seen it. And this is what's so distressing in a historical sense, right? It's one thing, for example, for you to believe, perhaps, and for others to believe that racism isn't that big a deal in 2013. I understand it. I don't agree with it, but I get it. Because we can look around and we can see outward manifestations of real progress, certainly better than 30 and 40 and 50 and 100 years ago. So it's easy to then assume that the problem is gone. But what's sad is that those of us who are white didn't even think this problem was real 50 years ago. Now we do in retrospect, we know it. If I were to ask you, do you think black folks had equal opportunity in 1963 or 1962 in education, employment, or housing? I'm sure every one of you would know that, of course, the answer is no. That was before the Civil Rights Act, before the Voting Rights Act, before the Fair Housing Act. But in 1963, when Gallup went out and asked white Americans that very question, not 50 years later, about 1963, but in 1963, right? At a time when racism was on the news every night. It's the year of the March on Washington. It's the year that the church in Birmingham is blown up. It's the year that George Wallace stands in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama. Medgar Evers is shot dead in his driveway in Jackson, Mississippi. It was a year when everyone paying attention had to know that we were a white supremacist apartheid system. And yet when Gallup asked white folks, do you think blacks have equal opportunity, 2 out of 3 whites said yes. Of course. Nothing to see here. Racism? What racism? And in 1962, 85% of whites said yes when they were asked, do you think black children have just as good a chance to get a good education as white children? Now, of course, in retrospect, we can look at that and go, God, that is delusional. Right? And it is, but those were otherwise decent people who believed that, weren't they? They weren't evil people, by and large. They weren't stupid. I mean, they were functional human beings. I assume that they're reasonably intelligent, mostly caring and compassionate and decent people. But they didn't see it. Even though it was blatant, they couldn't see it. Right? What does that tell you? It tells you that to be a member of the dominant group in a society is to have the luxury of being oblivious to other people's truth. Because, let's face it, they didn't have to know any better, did they? Like, to be white in 1963, you didn't have to know any better. You didn't have to know what people of color actually experienced, because it wasn't going to be on the test, right? Meaning the test you had to take to get out of school or to get into a college, or any test that you might have to take in order to get a professional license or certification for any job. Like, you didn't have to show that you actually knew anything about people of color's lives. And even though a lot has changed in 50 years, and I think we all realize that, that one thing has not. Right? To be white today, you still don't have to know people of color's truth. You still don't have to know people of color's reality. You still don't have to know that in 2013 we do not refer to folks of color as colored people. You still do not have to know that. Right? Because no one has ever required that you know it. No one has ever actually sat you down as a white person, sat any of us down and said, in order to be competent, you have to know this thing and that thing. But now people of color, they have to know our stuff. People of color have to know the things that we as whites decide are important things to know, because that's going to be on the test. That's going to be the whole test. Right? So people of color have to learn white literature, white theater, white poetry, white art. I know we don't call it that. Again, that is the point. Right? When your stuff is the norm, you don't have to racially designate it. You just get to call it literature, theater, poetry, art. You don't have to racially designate it at all. It just is what it is, right? But that's the problem of the dominant lens. And this isn't just a racial thing, so please. You know, I know people sometimes are like, oh my God, he hates white people. Let me clear this up. First of all, love me some white people. My wife is white, love her. Y'all saw me talking a minute ago before the speech. That's who I was talking to. I said I loved you, I meant it. Our daughters, both white. That's what happens when white people get famous. Love them. Mom, love her, she's white. Dad, don't get along with him, but that's not because he's white. That's about some other stuff. So it's irrelevant. That's the story. But it's not about white people. None of what I'm saying is really about white people. It's about whiteness. And it's about what whiteness does to those of us called white by allowing us to live behind this veil of ignorance, really, about other people's stuff. Whereas people of color can't do that. Same is true with gender, though. Same is true with class or sexuality, right? So men, we don't have to know what women experience in terms of mistreatment. Because they're women, we don't have to know, right? And if we do know, it's probably because a woman told us, and we chose to believe her, rather than to assume that she was being over-emotional, or God forbid, hormonal. Because as I'm sure you know, only women have hormones, apparently. I didn't know this, actually, but a dude told me that, so it must be true. Testosterone, no, it does nothing to us at all. But estrogen, oh, that will jack you up. So men get to be ignorant about women's experiences, right? And there's not really a consequence. But women got to know what men think is important. Right? And those of us who are straight, we don't have to know what LGBT folks experience in terms of straight supremacy or heterosexism. And if we do know any of it, it's probably because someone in our life who is lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender told us, and we decided in a moment of radical intuition that maybe they know their life better than we know their life. Imagine, right? What a radical concept. The same is true if you think about how you got into this room tonight, right? Like as I look out into the room, it appears to me that all or most of us certainly are able-bodied, at least temporarily, because if you live long enough, you know, we'll probably all have some type of disability or physical infirmity, right? But as able-bodied people, ask yourself, did you really pay close attention to how you got in the room? Because I didn't. I didn't give it a whole lot of thought. Why? Because I didn't have to. I didn't have to think about how long is it going to take to get from here to here. How am I going to get in the room? Are there steps leading up to the room? If there's a fire, God forbid, how am I going to escape, right? That's the kind of stuff that as an able-bodied person, I get to just sort of take for granted that nobody who's disabled can take for granted. Those are the kinds of conversations internally, if not externally, that folks with disabilities have to have because they know there are obstacles that they face. There are experiences about which they must be prepared that the rest of us don't have to be prepared for in the same way. And the fact that we don't think about that as able-bodied people does not make us bad people, right? Does not mean that we're bad people or that we're being deliberately oppressive to the disabled community, right? It just means that we have the luxury of not knowing some stuff. And the problem is when you don't have to know some stuff, the odds are pretty good you won't. And then when we try to come together and create community, it gets really tough. Right? It gets incredibly difficult because it's very hard to create community when you can't possibly put yourself in the shoes of that person with whom you're trying to build, right? And with whom you're trying to create a cohesive community. So none of this is really easy. I'm not saying that it will be. None of it is going to be free from any pain or any emotional angst or any of that discomfort that comes whenever we talk about issues of inequality and injustice. Because at some level, we're all pretty much good people. I mean, that's sort of the good news, and it's also the bad news, right? The good news is most people are good folks, regardless of race, regardless of class, regardless of gender, sexuality, religion, or whatever else. Most people are good people, right? And that's good in the sense that it means we're not mostly sociopaths. So that's something to work with. You We're not mostly sociopaths. We actually don't want to hurt people. That's good news, but the bad news in that, and there is some, is that sometimes good people, precisely because they're compassionate, and precisely because they don't want to hurt people, don't want to look at how they hurt people, right? Because you don't want to look at the ugly when you're really invested in the good. You don't want to look at how you might be drawn up into a system of inequality, because then, because you're a good person, you know you're on the hook, right? And it's a lot easier, isn't it, to not be on the hook. It's a lot easier to pass the ball to somebody else. It's a lot easier to pass the burden down to somebody else, just like my roommate tried to pass the burden of that gumbo down to me or one of the other 9 roommates. But I got news for you. If we don't, as a community, both here at this college, but really all around the country, figure out a way to engage that conversation and stop kicking it down the road to the next generation, there are going to be folks, our children and grandchildren, if we're lucky enough to have them either now or in the future, are going to be back in rooms like this in 30 or 40 years, having the very same conversation. Only then, the odds of actually creating and building multiracial democracy will be far more remote, and the risk of social catastrophe will be far greater. Because how in the world are we going to have a healthy society for anyone if we get to that day, 25 years from now, when half the population are people of color and half are white? How are we going to survive if we get there and half the population is still twice as likely as the other half to be unemployed, 3 times as likely as the other half to be poor, 9 years less life expectancy on average than people in the other half, double the rate of infant mortality, double the rate of low birth weight children born to moms in one half as opposed to the other, 1/20th the net worth? How is that a recipe for economic survival for any of us, people of color or white? I got news for you, it's not. And if we leave that legacy to our children because we refuse to clean up the mess just because we didn't make the mess, those children, those grandchildren, those great-grandchildren will curse our names, and we will deserve their curses, for we will have failed them miserably. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it. But you are those things.
But I think I'm more than that.
But you are those things.
No, you see, I think I'm more than that. I think that we all have a
But to be more than that, you have to also be
oh,
that.
Oh, sure. But you see, I think that you focus too much on that, and I don't want so much more than that. And I agree with you. I'm so glad that you brought up problems that we do have in our society, and I think those do have to do with personhood, and those have to do with abortion and euthanasia. But here's my question to you is, I just don't understand how we hope to address those problems when we're looking at people in terms of what you even agreed with less. And I certainly acknowledge I do have belong to a class and a sex and a race.
Well, and it matters, right? It has an effect.
Sure, but I think that you are totally neglecting this what's more. And I'm just wondering how we can address these problems and violations of personhood when we don't realize this greater truth. And if you're speaking
well, I actually agree with what you're saying about all of us being in the image of God. I also know that we have made the image of God a white man, and it's on the crucifixes at this college. So the fact that you can say that we're all in the image of God, yes, but Western Christianity has decided that God looks like my people. And first century Jews the notion that we're not a race when we decide to make Jesus black for a year. Just a year, and then we can switch it back, and then we can make it brown. And I know every time I say that, people get angry. They say, it doesn't matter what Jesus looked like. It only matters what he did. Cool. Then you don't need to make him look like that. We made him look like that. So in fact, I agree. We're all made in the image of God. If that's what we believe, that's totally cool. I get that. But in this society, you and I both know that we haven't had a society predicated on the notion of equal treatment, and the inequalities have been specifically about, among other things, although there are other things, they've been about race, they've have been about ethnicity, they have been about class, they have been about gender, they have been about sexuality, they have been about disability, so that those identity categories, because they have been given real weight and power, like they actually have had consequence, not because they should have, but because unequal societies made them meaningful. Now we live with the effect of that. To say we're not going to see that, or that we don't see that, and frankly, you can say that I'm anthropologically reductionist. I can assure you, based on the research from social psychology, that when you say you don't actually see black people, you are not being honest. Because there is no way that a person cannot see physical differences. You may feel as though those differences aren't a big deal for you, and that's awesome. Like, you don't make judgments. If that's what you mean, that's awesome. Although, the research says that even people who claim not to make judgments often do implicitly and subconsciously. So, for instance, one study recently took white folks, hooked them up to MRI machines and brain scan imaging machines, and had them staring at a computer screen. These are all people who said in a pre-test interview that they don't see color, that they aren't racist, that they don't have a racist bone in their body, that they're not prejudiced. And they all were very sincere, so far as anyone knows. They had them looking at a computer screen, and they flashed images on the screen so quickly, like 80 milliseconds or something, subliminal. You can't even tell what was seen. Your conscious mind can't register. When they would show pictures of a flower, or a goldfish, or a blade of grass, nothing. The brain, no activity, special activity. They showed an image of a black man for 80 milliseconds, not fast enough to have even been seen, and in every single case, with the exception of maybe one or two, the part of the brain right back here that lights up and responds to fear lit up like a Christmas tree. In other words, these individuals who aren't overtly biased and are no doubt really good, caring, compassionate people still have some implicit subconscious stuff because we've all been subjected to it. Advertising works, and it works on all of us, or else companies wouldn't spend billions of dollars to sell us junk we don't need. Like, they spend that money because they know they can make you want Charmin toilet paper. They can make you want Nikes and not Adidas. They can make you actually buy beef jerky. Who wants that? They can make you buy chocolate at the grocery store at the checkout line at People magazine, even though you didn't go there for that, and you don't even really want it, but you're like, oh my God, chocolate and people and In Touch, and I'm going to grab that magazine. That's impulse purchasing, and it's based on psychology. Psychology gets ahead of our ethics and our morality. We can want to be one type of person, and I think we mostly do, and I think it's great to aspire to that, but we've got to also deal with who we are, and who we are in the present. We live in a society where white folks, not because we are any better, but because we've been given unearned advantage, have what we have disproportionately, and people of color, because of unearned disadvantage, don't have what they don't have. We can either deal with that and try to rectify it, or we can say, let's not talk about that anymore, which is very convenient because it is the equivalent of the 5 left head start, just being, oh well, we have to shrug, we can't talk about it because if I notice that you have less or that I have more, I'm rejecting your larger humanity. No, I'm not. I'm dealing with sociological truth. So we have to deal with what's real even as we move towards something bigger. So I totally appreciate that race and class and sexuality and religion and all of these things that make us who we are in some way are not the end-all be-all of who we are. But if you don't see these people as part of who they are, which is, they would tell you that they see themselves as people of color, and so for you not to see them as that, you may think that's real hip, and they might not. And I think in this case, if they view it as an injury, it doesn't matter how you view it. An injury is only an injury to the injured. If I step on your foot, you don't ask me if it hurt, right? You ask you if it hurt. And so we can say things that we think make us sound very ecumenical and very, very spiritual and all of that, and at the end of the day, we can still be hurting someone. You need to know about me. If you're going to understand me, you got to know, yes, that I'm white, and that I'm male, and that I'm from the South, because that affects me as well, and my father was an addict and an alcoholic, and I come from a jacked up family like a lot of us do, and I'm Jewish, and I'm 5'8" in the tall man's world, and all that good stuff, because those things have consequences. Is that who I am at my core of my being? No, but those are things that have been given meaning by the society in which I live. In certain other societies, maybe they wouldn't mean as much. Like whiteness doesn't mean as much in a lot of other places, but here it means something. Height might not mean as much in certain other places, but in the West, it sort of has tended to mean something. There are historically societies that were not patriarchal, where being a woman was not correlated with being marginalized, but that is certainly the way it is now. And so I just feel as though we can either deal with that and try to rectify the social consequences of these ridiculous categories. And I'll grant you that it's absurd, that they're overly limiting of our humanity, absolutely. but they've had real consequence. And to act either as if they haven't, or to say, well, they have, but it would be better to just remember that we're all made in the image of God, isn't going to change that 20-to-1 wealth gap. Remembering that black people are made in the image of God, and that the first human beings actually would have been very dark, and not like the Adam and Eve that we put in the Bible children's storybooks that look like they were born in the Garden of Sweden. So that if anything, if we read the Bible literally, and I'm not saying that we should, but if you do, and you actually believe in God made those first humans in the image of God, guess what color God is? Okay, y'all can think about that for the rest of the evening, because in fact, those first people surely did not look white. They were surely not European. They were surely not light-skinned. So we can either deal with that, or we can act as if just saying that we're all made in the image of God and we're all precious is going to solve those inequalities. That's not going to put an AP class in any kid's college, any kid's high school, excuse me. That's not going to rectify the fact that right now the CDC estimates there are 85,000 black people a year who die because of excess mortality rates directly linked to unequal health care access, disproportionate exposure to lead, paint, and other toxins. Believing that they're in the image of God isn't going to save one of those people. I'm interested in saving 85,000 people from dying because of that institutional inequality. I'm interested in rectifying the fact that a typical white family has $100,000 more net worth than the typical black family, because that is killing people. That is affecting lives right now while we sit and talk. So I applaud you for your deep core of spirituality. I think that's lovely and beautiful and meaningful, and I'm sure, going to be a wonderful guidepost for you in your life. But I just think that it's incredibly short-sighted to think that alone, if that alone were capable of delivering us from racism, then we've been a Christian place overwhelmingly Christian place for a long time, and the church has been at this thing for an awful long time. And of course, the church has not only not stopped racism, the church has been directly implicated in racism. The church was directly implicated in the slaughter of indigenous people on this continent. The church was directly implicated in the conquest of the Southwest. It was directly implicated in sending indigenous children to boarding schools to strip them of their culture, to cut their hair, to kill the Indian and save the man for Jesus. So I think we can actually say that the church has some blood on its hands that it must now atone for, and it doesn't get to atone for it by simply carrying the cross and saying we're all made in the image of God. That is conservatives as people, just like I also do not necessarily love liberals as people. I think that, in fact, and I've written about this in 2 of my last 3 books, I made a real point actually calling out white liberals as being oftentimes, in a different way, in a different fashion, nonetheless guilty of perpetuating and operating on the basis of their own racism. So I don't reserve my criticism for the right by any stretch, and have actually probably written more that's critical of the so-called liberal left, at least the white left, than I have the white right. But in any event, what I would say is this: I think I think people should believe whatever they believe, and I think if you're a person of color who's conservative, that's fantastic. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that.
I would really wish I had, especially with this moving forward, has a conversation down. I do have one comment if I may. This is with all due respect.
Yeah.
I just believe that this is obviously we're dealing with some harsh realities and some harsh truths, but sometimes the way I see it, you get more with honey than with vinegar, and sarcasm and implicit mockery sometimes couldn't be as efficient as it did. I'm just saying that as a well perspective. But I do have a question, and this is.
And I appreciate you saying that. I do think, however, sometimes, and it's up to others to determine my deployment of it being appropriate or not. I do think that to have anyone suggest that there has not been a historical system of advantage for
saying in environment education is better.
I got you. Go ahead.
I'm an international student, and I appreciate a lot of what you said, especially since I've gone from societies with very different demographics.
Yeah.
From that perspective. And I just have a question about your underlying philosophy behind affirmative action, especially in self-predictive development. For instance, if you had a situation with a minority or a person of color with a rich background or a better status class-wise, what would the philosophy be? And it's like, for instance, we had someone with a white background but in a poor neighborhood.
Right.
Is it about curing the inequalities wherever they may be? Or I just want to
Well, it should be about all of those things. I mean, good admissions officers, and there are lots of them, and then there are some that aren't as conscientious, I suppose. Good affirmative action officers and people whose job it is to sort of do this kind of thing and really evaluate applicants for schools. The best of those typically know they need to look at a broad range of things. So they not only do they just want to look and see if someone's a person of color, but they also want to look and see if there's economic disadvantage. Maybe they're not poor, but maybe the school they went to was under-resourced and underfunded in a lower income zip code. And so that can actually work to the benefit, and it should, of white students who went to low-income schools or were low-income. A good admissions officer is going to look at that. And the fact that the kid's white is not going to be like, oh, well, we can't do anything for him, because that kid could have overcome all kinds of stuff, and that might be right there in the file. And I think it's very relevant for admissions officers to look at if you've overcome economic hardship, if you've overcome a broken home situation. In my case, I talked about it earlier with some of the students, the week before I took the SAT, my father tried to kill himself, so that probably is information that the school might have wanted to know. Like, that's why I didn't do so well, or at least that's the excuse I use. Maybe it's not the case, but it makes me feel better to think I was just traumatized, and that's why, But that's important. And so if I was applying to college and had I been prepared to talk about that then, which I wasn't, that I would hope that a school would say, well, he didn't do real great, but I mean, come on, look at what he just dealt with, and look at this other stuff in his file. So I hope that admissions officers, and I think most of them, the ones I've spoken with and met with over the years, are all pretty committed to making sure that they're looking at merit in a very holistic way that takes into account economic obstacles, racial obstacles, gendered obstacles, maybe regional and geographic obstacles, that kind of thing. As far as a student of color who's affluent, and there is a common misunderstanding, I think, that middle class or upper middle class or affluent people of color are unfairly getting benefits from affirmative action. Maybe it's okay if they're poor, but why should an affluent person of color receive any kind of special consideration or affirmative action, preference, quote unquote. And I would say that there are a couple of things to keep in mind. Number one, if that young person went to a really awesome school and had all these great resources and had AP classes and, test prep classes, they probably did pretty well in the SAT and they probably did pretty well in their GPA, and they're not going to need affirmative action is not going to be any part of their admission anyway, right? Let's just be honest. But having said that, like I said before, even students of color who were not poor are 2 to 3 times more likely than white folks who are poor to go to a mostly poor school. So even that black or Latino kid who isn't really themselves economically marginalized may be in an educational setting where they're surrounded by disadvantage, and that we know has a direct effect on their own academic performance, on their levels of preparation, on the classes that they were able to take. And so schools do want to take that into consideration, because even though they're not poor per se, there may have still been disadvantages attached to race and the neighborhood that they lived in, and still have significant housing discrimination facing not just low-income people of color. In fact, the biggest forms of discrimination are against middle and above, because it's people being charged more on an interest rate than, poor people don't buy houses, poor people rent. So if you're talking about mortgage discrimination, predatory lending, by definition, that's not poor people almost ever, but they still face, disparities. And there's one other thing that is really important from the perspective of testing and how we evaluate merit, and it speaks to this issue. There's now about 20 years of research. Most of it originated out of the University of Michigan and then Stanford, where Claude Steele, who was the head of the psych department there for many years, and his colleagues started doing this research on what he's identified as stereotype threat, stereotype vulnerability, right? This idea that members of stigmatized groups in the society who know about the negative stereotypes held about them, of course, even if they know the stereotypes aren't true, even if they're very strong and not, don't have a victim mentality, don't think that they are the stereotype, they know better, but they know that there are people out there who think they are. And what that research has found is that if you sit down to take, let's say, a high-stakes test, like the SAT, the GRE, the MCAT, the LSAT, etc., and you know, at least subconsciously, if not consciously, that if you underperform and you're a member of a stigmatized group, that your underperformance might get chalked up to racial identity, might get chalked up to, well, it's because you're black, or if it's a woman on a math exam, it's because women aren't as good at math, all this other, nonsense. And so when a person of a stigmatized group sits down and perform in a domain where their identity might end up being relevant to the interpretation of their performance, they actually don't do as well as they could. They actually underperform relative to their ability because of the stress and the pressure. And they've actually proven that by taking white folks and black folks, putting them in a room, equally qualified, all good students, putting them in a room, giving them a test, telling them that it's a test of verbal ability or something, right? And then watching what happens, telling them that it counts, it's going to matter. And the students of color underperform dramatically relative to the white students. They take another group, just the same as the first group in terms of their background, their grades, everything, put them in a room, give them the same test, and tell them, this doesn't count, it doesn't mean anything, we're not even going to grade it. And there's no difference between the white students and the black students. They've done it over and over again. Proving, really, over the years, they've done it with gender as well, they've done it with all types of categories, that even when someone is equally qualified, and in this case, the biggest effects of that stereotype threat are among middle class and above black and brown folks. In other words, it affects them the most because they're the ones who are most invested in proving that they're not the stereotype, right?